Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm joined today by my colleague Yvonne Spencer. We're both partners in the regulatory compliance team here at VWV. Both of us have had lots of experience dealing with exam-related issues for schools over many years now, and we're looking forward to talking to you about that very subject. Hopefully, a lot of what we say today will just give you the confidence that you already know what you need to know. But I'm hoping that through our years of experience and seeing what may not have gone so well for candidates and for schools, we might offer you a few valuable insights that you can take away with you. So, moving on to having a look at the session itself. So what we're going to have a look at for you today are the exam support duties. So we're just going to give you a little bit of legal framing and context, if you will, for what you are trying to achieve and why. Beyond, of course, the obvious. Then we'll have a look at the elements of support, and really this is a kind of taking a step back to try and give an overview for you, and we'll explain a bit more about that. Then we'll have a little look at the board processes and timetable. Now, there's a lot of detail there. We are starting from the point of knowing that you guys will be on top of much of that, so we're not going to linger on that. I'm sorry if we don't get to something today that you wanted us to. We will hopefully have an opportunity for questions later, but we will do our best. Then we're going to have a look at effective support and risk management case study. So really, we're going to have a look at an example, work that through for you, and pull out some of the things we've been talking about and how it all fits together. Finally, there'll be a few closing thoughts and an opportunity to answer some of your questions. Okay, without further ado, if we can move on. Okay, so as far as the duties are concerned for exam support, what do we mean when we talk about that? Obviously, what you want is the best outcomes for your pupils. These will be young people that you have taught for many years. You will have a huge investment in their success and their futures. So I think that bit goes without saying, but delivering effective post-exam services, as well as obviously all the work that's gone into getting to that point, has some real legal implications for you as well. So we've noted a few of them there for you. Risk management, obviously, if your pupils do well, generally everybody's happy, and the risks of complaints and claims and all of the things that go with that are greatly reduced. You do have contracts with the awarding bodies, the exam boards, so making sure, of course, that you're complying with all of the rules and regulations and ultimately delivering exam results which deliver on their key objectives, which are to produce the best outcomes for candidates, as well as maintaining integrity and public confidence in the examinations themselves. Regulatory compliance, of course. Now, there is potentially a bit of a disconnect here, because if a pupil doesn't achieve or perform as well as they would like to have done, there are reasons for that that don't necessarily imply any failure on the part of the school. But of course, there are aspects in which the delivery of education over the years may have some compliance aspects, and of course making sure that you are doing what you can for that pupil in the post-exam period to ensure that they are best placed for progression is also part of the duties that you have, and that's related to finally the duty of care that you have. And what do we mean by that? This is a legal term. It essentially is how you quantify the legal duty that you have to your pupils, and it essentially means that you will take reasonable care and skill, which a part of that is going to be following the relevant guidance, and of course that includes the exams guidance. And just briefly to sort of take a step back and a quick note about today's session, we are looking at the JCQ guidance in the context of general examinations. So general qualifications, rather. There of course are other qualifications, other exam boards and other guidance. So so we're not going to cover all of that. And I think the key message here is always to check the relevant guidance with the relevant awarding body for the specific qualification you're dealing with. Okay, I'm going to now just pass you on to Yvonne to take you through the next couple of slides.
Thank you, James. So just on this slide and building on what James has just explained for us, is just looking at the elements of support that will come from the school. And if there is a key takeaway today, I suppose, it will be about ensuring that you're all feeling confident about the various strands of support and things that are required to deliver the post-exam support to students. And as you'll see when we come to the case study, although they do run in parallel, and in fact, we've tried to bring out an example of where actually the different strands are interconnected and will be provoked at any particular time, depending on the facts as they're unfolding. So the first thing that you can see there is obviously this obligation to follow the board and know the board services. And as James has just said, we're working on the JCQ guidance, but there are individual elements that will apply to the particular awarding bodies that your school is contracted with. In addition to knowing and understanding those things, there'll be the obligation to provide the information to parents and pupils, and that will already have been have been done on that. You've also got a requirement to have an internal appeals process in circumstances where it's the view of the school that requests such as a review of results or a request for an appeal is not supported by the school. And having looked at various websites in preparation for today, we are aware that those appeals procedures have already been published and made available. So there is that whole thing about really understanding the post-exam result services that are available so that they can be articulated clearly and quickly to the students and their parents alike on the day. The other thing that goes in parallel with that, of course, is advice, assistance, and pastoral care. And you know, it's a really tense time when pupils don't get the results that they were expecting or hoped for, particularly with university applications and wishing to pursue particular courses of study post GCSE. You all know that, you know, that is your day-to-day role. But we're all conscious that there has been a rise in mental health difficulties amongst students, and some students will have gone into their examinations already with pre-existing mental health problems. So it's being aware of all those things and really knowing and understanding that particular student and what pastoral care they are going to need. In addition, and this is peppered throughout the JCQ guidance on post-exam services, is the requirement to provide advice and assistance on things such as contacting a university where a grade has been missed while the other post-exam services are taking place, because they take a number of days to go through. And there is also a recommendation in the JCQ guidance that UCAS is informed, because UCAS isn't informed when things like a request for a review of results is made. The only time UCAS hear about it is if there is a grade change. So think carefully about the advice and recommendations in the guidance. And implement it to demonstrate that you're taking all of these things seriously and fulfilling them. Which brings us on to the next point in that slide, of course, which is around information and complaints. Parents and students are desperate for information on the days, really understanding the nuances of what a request for review of results means, what appeals might yield. Because sometimes it's not as black and white as what students and parents imagine it's going to be. So take time to sit down and really explain how these things are approached by the examination board. And then keep an eye on complaints. Obviously, if there's deep disappointment, there may be, a propensity for parents to really bang the drum about complaining, and that's fine. Save that. That mustn't get in the way of the internal appeals procedure, which is for specific purposes to do with exams, where it relates to certain decisions, such as whether to request a review of marking and that sort of thing. So do make sure you keep them separate. I think it's also sensible, wherever possible, on the complaint side of things, to, although your complaints policies will have the regulatory requirement to have specific times for handling them, in some cases you may need to relax those timings to enable the post-exam procedures to take effect, and then just wait what sifts down. So it's very much a case by case, but just be aware that it may not be the most sensible thing to go hurtling into the complaints procedure, and you may need some agreement with the parents as to how you're approaching that, and that the priority is to deal with the post-exam services first. Next slide, please. So in terms of the specific obligations and services, these are laid out in the JCQ guidance. And the first thing there is quite obvious, is just the training. So relevant staff must be aware of rules and procedures. Think ahead of results day whether you think people need a refresh, given that people will have been out of school for a few weeks and hopefully had benefited from a lovely holiday. But just to ensure that everyone is in the know and really sharp and targeted and timely on the day. In terms of the pupil and student information, as we said already, be prepared to talk through the nuances and the details of those things, because it is more nuanced than I think sometimes parents expect, in terms of the criteria that will be applied and the parameters of what those procedures can do. There is a requirement for senior staff to be, they must be available to students, pupils immediately after publication. And, that's something I know that you'll be all too familiar with. We see also that it's very important on occasions for senior staff to have subject heads available to support as needed, because often the subject heads will know so much about the pupil's performance and the narrative around that, which can be so helpful when making these decisions, particularly in the early stages. I mentioned already the internal appeals process, and just make sure that everyone is familiar with it by the time results days come around. And then I've mentioned already the UCAS and university progression. And then we've talked about complaints already, but we are going to bring that out in the case study, because I think that generates, as James has said already, some really good considerations of what can happen in practice, and give you the benefit of our experience there. Next slide, please. So we've mentioned that we are looking at JCQ guidance, and this is the guidance here in this slide that we've provided the titles of. The reason we've done that is that on the day and beforehand and in preparing, we think it's really important that everyone who's involved from the school's perspective is very familiar with these documents. Otherwise, there can be an awful lot to do on the day trying to marshal the information that's in this guidance, and because it is a requirement that it's followed. And also just being aware that if something has been missed or something hasn't gone right, actually that may prompt malpractice, maladministration, which we'll come on to shortly. So do be aware, but also be aware of the individual exam boards practices, because there are some slight additions or different ways of doing things. So have that available too. And it might be useful to have these all printed out for relevant senior staff on the day, so that everyone's really good and ready to go and drill into the detail as needed. Next slide, please. And I'm going to hand you back to James.
Thank you, Yvonne. And that brings me sort of neatly now into this. So this is just an extract from the JCQ post-result services guidance. It's some of the key dates. These, I'm sure, will already be red flagged in everybody's diaries. If they're not, then that's a takeaway. I think, of course, we've got the results days themselves, and then some crucial deadlines. So the last dates for submitting various requests as set out. And part of the reason for capturing this information now is really to illustrate what I think Yvonne and I have both mentioned already. There are a large number of considerations that will be in play immediately following the publication of exam results. Of course, they will vary depending on the specific case, but it is worth thinking about them altogether, because you are going to need to plan quite a careful sequence and ensure that your sequencing can meet all of the relevant deadlines. And we'll put a little bit more meat on those bones as we go through. I think the case study will help to pull that out. But certainly, I think our experience is that where things go wrong is that you can become very focused on pursuing one particular process, and you might miss a really key opportunity to do something that could improve the candidate's outcome, and of course manage some of the risk involved for the school as well. So if we just move on to the next slide, please. So here we're looking at the specific board services, and as I say, I mean, these are things which I think will be very familiar to you all. And what we've done is just pull out some of the headline information, which I'm not going to dwell too much upon, but you'll see in terms of the distinctions about whether you can make individual or sort of cohort requests, and whether the consent is required, and deadlines. I mean, those are the things that you absolutely must know. So as far as some of the specifics are concerned, so you can request a copy exam script, and the point of that, of course, would be to inform decisions about reviews of marking principally, and that is something that you can do immediately upon publication of results. It's done as a sort of electronic service, so it's quick, and so something that's well worth considering. There is, of course, a related but separate process for requesting original exam scripts, and that only really applies if you want to see those scripts to inform teaching going forwards. It's a much slower service, plus what you're also doing is, of course, taking away the primary piece of evidence from the boards. So by requesting original exam script, what you're doing is precluding any option to then request a review of marking. So just important to be clear on the distinction there. With the clerical recheck, I mean, this is really just a check that somebody hasn't made an error when they're totting up the marks, or something of that nature. They would be looking specifically at whether all parts of the script have actually been marked, the totaling of the marks, and then the recording of the marks. So it's really very much about the sort of administration of the process, and it can be useful. But you'll see that the deadline there is the 26th of September. So if you're dealing with A-level results, for example, university applications are at stake, then actually really think about how you are going to prioritize getting the most effective process going. And that brings us on. I'm not going to dwell on review of moderation for the moment, but it's worth mentioning that it is something that is available to schools. Priority review of marking and a review of marking, the difference of course being that a priority review of marking is on a shorter timescale and it is limited to A level and high level, certain high level qualifications. The point being that it enables a quicker turnaround, so that will support you to hopefully help your candidates gain their university places. The point of the review of marking is to have somebody, an officer of the exam board, review the excuse me, to review the marking of the paper, and they're looking for, again, administrative errors, but also failure to apply the mark scheme correctly, where the answer is a right or wrong, so just a binary, or an unreasonable exercise of academic judgment. So that one perhaps is the most interesting, although I think worth saying, so far as academic judgment is concerned, it's a high bar, because there is quite a significant range of what would be considered reasonable judgment. So the fact that you might disagree wouldn't be enough, and certainly in practice, I think we see that schools feel very energized sometimes where they've seen some marking that perhaps they don't agree with, and I think it's not always appreciated necessarily just how difficult it is to be able to demonstrate that somebody's judgment, although different, perhaps even markedly so, doesn't amount to an unreasonable exercise of academic judgment. So definitely worth making that point. And then appeals as well. So that's a sort of second line service. The point about appeals is that it is a way of challenging board decisions. So whether that's a review of marking decision or a decision on another request or board service. And they have some timelines. So 30 days after the outcome is the deadline for you to request an appeal, but actually the appeals process itself can take 42 days if you want a first line decision. If you want an appeal hearing, it could be a further 70 days. So it's quite a long process. And when you're thinking about how to get the very best outcomes in the quickest time for your pupils, that's clearly going to be a factor. Next slide, please. Okay, so just looking a little bit more about the appeals, because I know that in practice we see schools, I think, sometimes find it difficult to grapple with what are the grounds for an appeal. When would you actually make an appeal? Because of course you'll be under a huge amount of pressure sometimes from candidates and their parents about doing everything possible that's got, even the most remote prospect of improving the candidate's position. You, on the other hand, will be thinking about all sorts of things in terms of the cost of that potentially, as well as the time and the effort that goes into that, and raising expectations where in fact there's no reasonable prospect of an outcome. So a favourable outcome rather. So as I said, it's a second line service, so it is appealing a decision that has already been made by the board. That could be a decision about results, but it might equally be decisions taken in malpractice cases, or where you've applied for special consideration, perhaps something along those lines. So always be sure to check the guidance for the specific requirements relating to the type of appeal that you are requesting. Many of the processes are similar, but there are some differences, and they can be important. So the grounds are that an error has occurred, so an outcome that could not reasonably have been arrived at by a board, or that the exam board didn't apply their procedures consistently, fairly, or properly. So when we're looking at an error, I mean, you would be looking at essentially the three aspects that also apply to the review of marking. So it could be an administrative error. It may be that failure to apply the scheme correctly, where the answer is just a binary correct or false. and it may be an unreasonable exercise of academic judgment. Again, I think that's where many of the appeals are likely to sit, but again, subject to that health warning that that's not an easy case to make. So again, that will be a factor in the decisions that you go through with candidates and parents, and maybe a feature of internal appeals as well, if you decide that you don't want to support those appeals as well. So I mentioned already briefly, but there's a two-stage process. So the first is that there is essentially a on the papers review by an officer of the exam board. So you would make your request in writing on the application form and provide some supporting evidence at that stage. That would be considered on the papers. Any investigation that was required to get to an answer will take place at that point, and then you will get a written decision with reasons. Now, at that stage, then the question will be whether or not you want to take it to the next stage, which is to request an appeal hearing. And as I've said, that can take a long time. So when you're looking at how you knit all of the various considerations together to try to get the best outcome most quickly, appeals hearings aren't necessarily going to be the ideal solution. Nevertheless, it is worth considering. If there is an appeal with any real prospect of success, then I think not only would it be sensible to pursue it, but I think really you are obliged to do so. Just referring back to your duty of care to the pupil. So, excuse me. When you've pursued an appeal process, it hasn't been successful, there is a further stage of escalation that you can pursue. The Exam Procedures Review Service is an administrative service essentially offered through Ofqual. It's an independent review of whether board procedures have been followed. I have to say it doesn't apply to all appeals, is the first thing to say. The second thing is that it's a pretty limited service in that it is exactly what it says it is. It is a review of whether board procedures have been followed. So there's going to be no substantive consideration of the underlying appeal. And I have to say, I think I have yet to see one actually be successful. Nevertheless, sometimes I think having a further process to pursue, another way to be able to reassure parents and candidates that absolutely everything has been done, can be helpful. Not always, but worth considering. And then finally, we mentioned this for completeness, it's very rarely going to be something that we would recommend you consider, but decisions taken by exam boards around public exams are subject to public law judicial oversight. So you do have the option to legally challenge them if you have the grounds to do so through judicial review. Obviously, we'd recommend that you take advice about that. It's challenging, to say the least. The bar is set very high to be able to succeed in those types of reviews, but nevertheless, it's one more element that's worth considering in some cases. Okay, and next slide, and I'm going to pass you back to Yvonne.
Thank you, James. So just sticking with the theme of the parallel strands of the things that schools should be thinking about and doing at this time, then just a couple of points on this slide. Now, the first thing is around special considerations. So there is an opportunity, possibly, that late applications for special considerations, it may still be possible to submit these. And the thing to note there is that it would have to be submitted before a deadline for review of results. So that's one element where you're going to have to get in quickly if something comes to light that is worthy of special consideration. And we cover that off in the case study in a moment, so you can just see how we've thought about how that can be considered at this stage. So important to think about that. And then also think about whether there has been any malpractice on the part of the centre. There's a slide in a moment that defines malpractice and maladministration, which I will explain. The requirement is to report any suspected malpractice immediately, and this can have a potential outcome for the student and their results, because the board must consider and seek to address the impact on the pupil or student. So it's something to think about, and it's something to think about not just in terms of all of the things that have been done up to and concluding the sitting of the exam itself, but also in this post-results phase. If something were missed, such as a deadline, for example, that could of itself amount to malpractice, maladministration, and that could, that should be reported as outlined on this slide here. Next slide, please. So here we are in terms of this definition of malpractice. So it covers, as I've said, malpractice and maladministration, and it means any act, default, or practice which is in breach of the regulations and or breach of the awarding body's requirements of how the qualification should be delivered, and a failure to follow established procedures in relation to the qualification. So then you have to consider the second part, which gives rise to the prejudice to candidates and or compromises public confidence and or compromises attempts to compromise the process of the assessment, the integrity of the qualification, or the validity of a result and or certificate, and or damages the authority, reputational credibility of any awarding body or centre, etc. So there are forms that are in the JCQ guidance when you make these referrals. Do check individual exam boards' requirements also. And just as we've said, remain live to these possibilities right through to the post-exam results procedure. Next slide, please. So here we're going to embark on a case study with you, and this is fairly typical. So pupil Amy is awarded a grade C in her maths A level, and this means she fails to meet the offer from her first choice of university. She was predicted a grade A and needed at least a B to meet the terms of her offer. She's very upset upon receiving her results. She already suffers from severe anxiety and is already in receipt of counselling. So next slide, please, just to develop this further.
Yes, so just picking that up. Amy's first choice university have said that they won't accept her with a C grade in maths, but something new comes to light that is really important. So on the day of the maths exam, Amy'd received some bad news that her grandfather had just been given a diagnosis of a life-limiting condition. She did not inform the school at the time. So, I mean, this is interesting, isn't it, Yvonne? As you say, I mean, I think this is something that we do see in practice a lot. And of course, immediately you will be thinking in terms of that getting a C where you need at least a B and have been predicted an A. I mean, that's going to be very difficult for Amy, isn't it? She's already grappling with a lot. We know that she's already got a history of mental health challenges. So all of that is something I think that that schools are going to want to think about immediately. How do they support her in a way that's going to be most helpful to her, but also actually what are the elements, what are the sort of the processes that they're now going to need to start considering and putting into place. And then we come back to that piece about tying together the various timelines and making sure that the sequencing is right.
And James, just to add there, I suppose as a bit of a precursor to the previous slide, I mean, one of the things that schools will do in these scenarios is be absolutely clear with the student that, you know, that they contact the university and seek absolute clarity that the grade is, you know, there's no latitude on that.
Yeah.
They offer the grade to change.
Yeah.
So, you know, as schools will be doing that already, but it's always worth thinking about.
It is, absolutely. And of course, we know, you know, each year pupils miss their offers, they go through clearing, they get a place they're perfectly happy with. So that's another thing that's worth considering. Or, you know, ultimately, do they want to defer their university place? Do they and think about maybe resit? So there are lots of options here. But I mean, the one, of course, that we are getting at, if it wasn't clear enough and you know, like a neon sign, is that, you know, actually, what about a late application for special consideration? We know that that might give her a little lift in the marks. Of course, it's within a very specific range, so a maximum of 5% and more ordinarily less than that for less than the most exceptional cases. So, I mean, is that something that you would be considering with a school right now?
Yeah. Shall we move to the next slide, James?
Yes.
Lovely. Okay, so the scenario unfolds further. So the exam board awards Amy a 3% uplift on her marks following the submission of a late application for special consideration. So we were able to make the exceptional circumstances point here. Her grade does not change, but she's now just a few marks off the B grade boundary. So we just need to think here about the parallel possible things that can be done in order to try and move her grade up higher. And as we've just heard from James, with a special consideration, she could have got up to 5%. So there's a point to make there. And at this point, James, would you be advising a school to apply for the script?
Yes, so I mean, I think that's something almost going back to the immediate moment when pupil has received her result and is disappointed with it. You know, if you're going to request a copy script, do it quickly, do it early, because you'll be in the best possible position to make informed decisions. So I think, yes, if you haven't already done so at this stage, then absolutely. And then there are two key sort of exam board processes I think that you'll want to be thinking about here. And the first is, well, you've only had a 3% uplift, whereas Yvonne and I have both said the maximum was 5%. So do you have grounds for an appeal? And is that something that's going to be sensible to pursue at this stage? Or perhaps now you'd be looking at a review of marking. And of course, if you've seen the script, you'll be able to take an informed view as to whether there is any grounds or prospect of that delivering a better outcome. And of course, the review of marking, particularly if you access the priority service, is going to be turned around much more quickly than an appeal. So I would suggest that is probably the starting point.
Thank you, James. Let's just move on to the next slide in our case study here.
Okay, so yeah, no,
sorry.
sorry. So yeah, I mean, we've made that application now. Following the review of marking, Amy's only a single mark from achieving a B grade, and although this sounds obviously beautifully constructed as an exam sort of scenario, I have seen this very thing actually in practice. So she'd like to know now if there's anything else the school can do. So what do you think about that, Yvonne?
Well, I think the first thing, and we've touched on this, is consider the appeal of the special consideration, but it's not the most timely remedy, is it, in terms of this? But we could also think about appeal of review of marking, and we would need to ensure that we had grounds and manage their expectations. So there are certainly those things that could happen. So in terms of the grounds for appeals, so as you've explained them already, if there is going to be an appeal, it's going to be absolutely targeted at those grounds, rather than a sort of a general exposition of how awful this is for the student. It's really important that you marshal the arguments in those terms, and explain how you're approaching it to the student and their parents, to manage their expectations also.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I was going to say that this is the point at which I think dialogue with parents and pupils, students, tends to start to become a little bit more difficult and strained. And it may be that once you look at the merits of an appeal of the decision for special consideration or review of marking, you come to the conclusion that you don't have grounds for either, and that's going to be complex. You'll have an internal appeals procedure potentially to deal with then if parents and pupils disagree. It's always worth considering that balance, striking the right balance between being seen to be a sort of champion and supporter for parents and pupils, students in a difficult situation, and of course unrealistically raising hopes and expectations. So I think at the point at which you're considering an appeal, we're now looking at the law of sort of diminishing returns. The focus of the conversation perhaps needs to be continually more looking at what are the other options. Do you defer a year, think about retakes, all of those sorts of things alongside, just to ensure again that if all else fails, you're still doing all that is possible in the circumstances to get the best outcomes for the pupil.
Thank you, Jane. Shall we move on to the next slide?
Yes.
So, so where we get to now is that we are unhappy with the outcome of the appeal, and the parents complained to the school. And the basis for that is that as a reasonable adjustment for Amy's anxiety, she was meant to have been seated at the back of the exam hall for all exams. And a mistake was made, which resulted in her sitting in the middle of the exam hall for her maths exams, surrounded by other pupils and students, which she found to be distressing. Now, appreciate that undoubtedly all of this would have come to light much sooner on in the scenario, but let's just suspend belief for a moment and just pick up the point that the point is we want to highlight that there are still things that you can think about. And as we've said, the takeaway is to be alive to all of the different strands so that you can keep advancing the possibility of getting an improved outcome for Amy. So the point we really wanted to make here is that this was an adjustment, wasn't it? It was an access arrangement for her to sit at the back because of the anxiety. And the fact that that did not happen is an example of malpractice / maladministration. And so therefore, if genuinely this is only coming to light now, or indeed whenever it does come to light, then it's important that the malpractice requirements are followed to the letter, which means reporting immediately. So that's certainly something to think about there. In terms of the timing of when of what would happen next and when a decision might be made, James, I'm really interested to know what your experience would be. How quickly is this all going to sift down? Because quite a lot in our scenario has happened already. Lots of days will elapsed. Lots of her friends will be celebrating having got into universities of choice, and we know that she's already suffering with anxiety. In your experience, how do you think this is going to play out time-wise for Amy now, and what can the schools do to ameliorate any impact on Amy?
Yes, I mean that's a key consideration. Of course, as I mentioned, sort of as we were going through, there is a bit of a law of diminishing returns with this. Processes tend to become more protracted. The prospects of getting a good outcome, I think, get less as you go along. There's a few processes in here that we know do not run quickly, or at least quickly within the in relative terms to the timeline to be able to secure university places. So maladministration and malpractice procedures through the boards, they're not quick. They're not quick because they are not designed necessarily to support that sort of results to next stage of progression timeline. But of course, I think the point that is key here is that one, you would have no option. A failure
Yeah.
to follow the guidance, I think, is absolute in terms of it's very likely to amount to maladministration, which is malpractice. You would have to report that to the board, then goes through an investigation. One of the things that's interesting about it, I think, is that boards do have a broader discretion when they're looking at cases of malpractice to consider the outcome and the impact on the candidate. So with special consideration, and special consideration is something else that you might be considering in this context as well. But so far as malpractice is concerned, if a centre's failure to follow process has had a detrimental impact on a candidate, the board might have some scope to be able to adjust the marks accordingly. So I think it is something that is not only, as I said, probably an obligation in these circumstances, but it
Yes.
can actually be helpful anyway, ultimately. But it's not going to happen quickly. Certainly, it's not going to happen in time to be able to secure that place and make your start in September. So this is where we have to look at, you're quite right, those types of practical things. What can you do to try and soften that impact? Maybe dialogues with universities explaining what the position is, what you're doing, what the timeline's going to be, and inviting them essentially to keep the place open for a late start. Mostly they will have some sort of final hard deadline. I think keeping the exam boards up to date also about that, and any deadlines from your end will help to ensure that they can prioritize the processes they're dealing with, again with a view to minimizing impact on candidate. So yes, I think it is just about that sort of joined up communication and approach the whole way through.
Thank you, James. I think we're on the final slide now before we go to Q&A.
Yeah, so really this is just sort of bringing back together some of the things that we've talked about, and make sure that you've got those key dates absolutely pegged, because ultimately things are going to move fast on exams day. If things haven't gone well, then you're going to need to be able to have some focused conversations and make some quick decisions about what you need to do, knowing what you will have needed to do by when and what is possible, and to be able to construct a joined up strategy, I think, is really key.
Yeah.
Of course, we've said ensure staff understand board procedures and requirements and the school's duties. You've attended this presentation, so hopefully that's supported you with that. But again, this is just really about making sure that you're very clear about the way all of these things come together, and things aren't dealt with in a siloed way, which is where we see things, I think, go wrong in practice quite regularly. That sort of plays into the next point, which is be joined up and outcome focused, always thinking about impact on pupil. If you can limit the impact on pupil of whatever may have gone wrong, it is inevitably going to put the school equally in a much better position. So I think that's key to keep that in mind. Timely and effective action, of course, is the best way to try to limit impacts and improve outcomes. And again, this just comes back to being really quite considered in terms of what are going to be the best options to pursue and in what sequence, as well as, of course, a clear dialogue and managing expectations as you go. It's really, and we've made this point, but as you go through again, it's this thing about becoming very focused on, well, we're going through a review of marking, we want to appeal that now. but actually at the same time, just keep an eye out for some of those broader obligations. Is there some malpractice here that you've spotted? You've got some specific duties, make sure you're meeting those. Complaints, again, you know, your complaints handling duties don't disappear because you're within this context, but you may need to take an adjusted approach, as Yvonne said, but make sure those complaints are identified, logged, and that you've got a plan for ensuring that you're meeting your obligations there. And finally, there will be times when you're looking at circumstances where you'll think, well, look, this could give rise to some sort of a claim against the school. Think about your reporting obligations to insurers. Make sure that you're reporting at the right time. Otherwise, you may lose cover for any legal action that comes. And of course, and we would say this, wouldn't we? But seek legal advice where applicable. Sometimes things are just really complicated. You won't necessarily know the answers. That's fine. And asking the right questions of the right people at the right time, I think, is going to be a really important part of being able to manage risk and improve outcomes.
And James, I just wanted to add a point, because obviously the focus of our team regulatory and compliance is very much pupils, students, parents, etc. But of course, if we're dealing with a malpractice, maladministration point, there will be employee rights, which are all laid out in the JCQ malpractice guidance. So for those that are wondering about employees, we do get it. It's just that this is our focus for today.
Yes, no, absolutely. And of course, we know that, you know, a malpractice report and investigation by a board can lead to outcomes that will impact sometimes upon centres. There can be restrictions put on centres and or individuals, and that might also impact their ability to perform their particular role. So yeah, absolutely, those things all need to be factored into the decisions taken about whether that's something that you are obliged to do and how you go about it. Okay, right. Well, I think that takes us on to some questions and answers, doesn't it?
Yes. Just checking the chat. We haven't got any questions in the chat, but do feel free to add some if you would like to, or ask them. If you would prefer not to ask them now, but would prefer to get in touch, you are very welcome to do so. And in the slide, in the final slide in a moment, you'll see that our contact details are in there, and you will be receiving a recording and the slides after this event. So do feel free to get in touch with us. So unless there is anything from anyone, I think it just remains for us to thank you again for your interest and for joining us this morning. It's been a pleasure to present to you. And then finally, if you wouldn't mind just filling in the feedback form, we would really appreciate that, because it does help us think about how we design future content and the topics that we select. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.